Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Lucinda Rouse.
And I'm Andy Ricketts. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings on in the charity world. And this week we'll be finding out how the charity behind the Duke of Edinburgh's award is measuring the impact of its work.
Now, this is always a hot topic for us. Effectively measuring and reporting the impact charities are having on the people or causes they exist to support is obviously a vital piece of work. And it's not only about proving that an organisation is on the right track to its funders or other stakeholders. Rigorous impact measurement also enables internal tweaks and adjustments by identifying areas that perhaps aren't going as well as anticipated. We've previously looked on this podcast at theories of change and how charities driving systems change can measure the impact of their work. Today, we'll be exploring how the Duke of Edinburgh's award has overhauled its impact measurement in recent months.
And with us in the studio to tell us more is the charity's chief executive, Ruth Marvel. She's been at DofE for almost 6 years and previously held senior positions at Girl Guiding and Scope. Hello, Ruth. Thanks very much for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Now, tell us about your new impact measurement framework and how it came into being.
So back in sort of 2021, we developed a new strategy for Duke of Edinburgh's award. And for those, I guess, who aren't familiar with what DofE does, we are a youth development programme, essentially. So we support young people to develop themselves, to build their sort of life skills and confidence and sort of self-belief and resilience. Understanding the impact that we were having on young people was really important to us. But it had always been quite a difficult space. It's quite, there are lots of factors that influence young people's lives, particularly during adolescence. As part of putting together our new strategy, we were really keen to think about, how can we take a bit of a step forward and improve the way in which we are sort of able to capture that data. As part of developing the strategy, we also developed our sort of first theory of change. So we sort of co-created that with young people, and our adult sort of volunteers really tried to sort of get under the skin of what difference do we think we're making, which is a really interesting piece of work in itself, because that sort of, when we created something that we ended up calling sort of my DofE journey, and it was all really framed with young people in mind to sort of help young people understand the sort of the process that they were going through as they were taking part in the award, doing lots of different activities and hopefully having a lot of fun while they did it. But what was the sort of stuff that's happening sort of beneath the surface, and how does that translate from a sort of short-term impact through the sort of medium into sort of longer-term positive gains, we hoped. I guess you've done a podcast on theories of change, and in some ways that was a really helpful tool for us in terms of really trying to sort of set out and understand the change we think is happening. And then we wanted to try and develop an impact measurement framework that would enable us to sort of test whether or not our assumptions were right. One of the principles we sort of set out when we were trying to do it was we wanted this information to be available to young people. It wasn't just something we wanted to sort of squirrel away as the charity. We wanted, we're all about helping young people develop. So we wanted this information and this evidence to be sort of available and visible to young people so they could use it for their own sort of self-reflection and to help think about the journey that they'd been on. So we worked with an organisation called State of Life, who had a really sort of innovative, I thought, approach to impact measurement, where they used essentially data that's existing big data sets. And they helped us to map essentially the impacts that we've identified through our theory of change against questions that already existed in sort of big government data sets. So we use things like the active lives survey and some of the census data, because what this helps us do is means that we are using questions that are already sort of tested and peer reviewed, and we know are really robust in terms of research questions. But we also have the advantage of being a massive government sort of data set that already exists. So the big question in impact measurement is the sort of so what? You can collect lots of information about your participants, but can you measure it against kind of perhaps young people who hadn't participated? And I think for lots of organisations, creating that sort of control group is really difficult. It's really expensive as well. So we were looking for a way that was going to mean that we could do this in as cost-effective way as possible, that we could gather data on a large number of young people. We have about sort of 550,000 young people participating in DofE every year. And we wanted these tools to be available to everybody. So we worked with State of Life to identify essentially a series of questions from national government data sets that mapped against the outcomes that we were looking for. And we then essentially embedded those questions in our CRM system, which kind of has all the information on our participants and tracks their progress through the DofE programme. And then we ask various questions at various points. So some at the beginning, some when they're completing different sections of the award, and some at the end. And that sort of builds us a really nice picture of kind of what's changing over time. Our first impact report that we published just before Christmas 2024 has gathered sort of data on about over 40,000 young people, all of whom have completed a DofE programme, and has enabled us to draw some really useful sort of conclusions, and positively found that we are seeing a statistically significant sort of positive improvement in a whole range of kind of areas, from sort of life skills through to well-being and sort of community connectedness, which is a big part of DofE's sort of volunteering section, is around helping young people feel part of, like, a sense of belonging to their community.
How long did it take?
Quite a long time. So we developed our theory of change sort of back in 2021. And then it probably took us about sort of 9 months to a year to sort of develop the framework. And what's been really good about the relationship with State of Life is that they're really helping us to sort of transfer that kind of knowledge and expertise. So now I've got my sort of impact measurement lead internally has sort of really is owning all of that work and has been learning how to sort of analyse the data. But then the time lag has largely been around waiting for young people to sort of complete their activities. So it's been a bit frustrating because we've been sitting there thinking, well, it's already kind of, when do we get the results? But we've had to be patient and sort of wait for enough young people to come through. It takes sort of between about a year and 2 years on average for young people to complete a DofE programme. So there's a bit of lag time while we wait for the results.
And it's interesting to hear about how you decided what information you needed to be gathering would be beneficial to you and also to the people who were completing the Duke of Edinburgh Award. Would you say that you're collecting more information now than you were previously?
We have about 15 questions in the framework, and we deliberately decided to keep it quite sort of tight because we want as many young people to answer the questions as possible. And there's always a balance to strike between asking lots of things and getting people to actually complete it. So, but we're certainly collecting, I'd say, data that we hadn't been able to collect before. We're collecting it from a vastly larger number of young people because we've been able to embed all of these questions in our kind of app and our CRM system. The value of having used questions that already exist in national data sets is we've now got some really useful comparison data. So we can look at our participants and we can compare them to sort of young people generally. The exciting thing about it is that some of this data is so rich and there's so much of it, both from our side but also in the national data sets, that we can, over the kind of next few years, we can really start to sort of segment it and drill down into, we can look at different demographics, we can look at different geographies. So that's the real, I think, value of it. We've got such a lot of potential to do some really interesting work where, we have a big focus on trying to ensure that we are reaching the most marginalised young people and that kind of there aren't barriers to participating in DofE programmes. So it's going to be really helpful for us to be able to look into some of those sort of different demographic groups and it's also been helpful to us in terms of going back to our theory of change and sort of testing with ourselves whether the assumptions that we had made sort of are borne out by the data. Encouragingly, they largely are. And the other thing we've done is we're really interested in the impact that participation in DofE has on young people's well-being. And so we used what are called the Wellbe benchmarks, which are kind of the four research questions, which are kind of, have been established as a sort of standardized measure of well-being. And those have a kind of a mechanism attached to them, which allows you to calculate the sort of financial value of the increases in well-being that you see. So that's been an additional sort of value from this piece of work, in that we've now essentially can say that, there's about on average about a £4,400 equivalent in sort of improvements in well-being that we can attribute to sort of participation in DofE, which, when you're talking to young people and you're talking to parents and you're talking to all of the different partner organisations we work with, some of this data that says, here's the evidence we can present that shows you the difference that participation in this programme will have for you or for your young person or for your students is really powerful.
And what are some of the challenges? I mean, you spoke earlier about the more than 500,000 people who take part in the DofE. What are some of the challenges that are associated with having so much data? I mean, it must be almost overwhelming, I should imagine.
Yeah, I mean, there's the challenge of collecting a lot of data on a lot of young people. Obviously, we've had to consider our things like our sort of data protection sort of requirements quite carefully. We strongly encourage young people to sort of participate and to use the questions, but obviously not everybody does, and not everybody finishes a DofE programme either. So at the moment, we're just focusing on generating impact data for young people who complete a DofE programme. I'd be really interested down the line to be looking at, we know that, for some young people who finish perhaps only one section of the award, the impact of that can be really significant. I'd love us to be able to go into a bit more detail and sort of be able to look at kind of what's changing for those young people who perhaps don't get to the end.
You're looking at one here.
Oh. Because one of the elements of the design of a DofE programme is they're quite long. We have a sort of proportion of young people for whom we can't gather data at the moment using the approach that we've taken. There is a degree still of a little bit of sort of selection bias, which is always a challenge in kind of any of these sort of impact measurements, that the people who are more likely to fill the questions in are the people that you have data on. But we work really hard and work with State of Life to do all of the sort of statistical, to make sure that we were doing that work really robustly and to make sure that kind of the sample that we'd chosen was a sort of representative of diversity of our participants. I mean, the other is, we just are gathering we have a huge amount of data. And if anything, the question on where we prioritise, and, we've started by providing a sort of overview of all of our participants. But I mean, we've just done a piece of work to analyse the kind of impact of young people who've been participating in some of our sort of strategic growth programmes, which we'll be publishing sort of in the autumn. So some of the work that is kind of drilling in essentially and looking at sort of the different types of work that we're doing and some of the sort of specific sort of projects and programs that we're doing is quite exciting. And I think the other thing to say, we work in a really diverse range of settings and we work with a really diverse range of young people. So at the moment, our current framework isn't really sort of suitable for our participants with additional needs and our participants who are in youth justice settings. So we're doing some work at the moment to sort of develop the way in which we ask the questions and record the sort of answers to mean that it's suitable for basically kind of those two demographics of our participants.
And presumably you have different ways of packaging the data for different audiences and even possibly even young people in different settings as well.
Yeah, and that's as I said at the beginning, this is one of the things that was really important to us, was that a lot of this sort of data collection tends to be sort of anonymised, and obviously it's anonymised from our point of view in terms of kind of analysing the data, but we really wanted to make sure this data was available to young people. This is about their experience and the change and sort of development that they go through. So this data now sits essentially in individual young people's sort of DofE accounts. They can see essentially what they answered at the end. So we would really like to do a bit more with that in terms of how can we really help young people use that as a bit of a tool for sort of reflecting on the sort of the journey they've been on, the changes that they've seen. Self-reflection is a really important part of personal development. So we're hoping that this is something that's going to be sort of we can really sort of develop. So it's not just a question of how useful is this data for us? And so far it's been fantastic in terms of being able to demonstrate to our supporters and our donors the impact that we're having. It's been fantastic to feed back to our sort of partners and all of our amazing sort of DofE volunteers and leaders to say, look, we've got some really useful empirical evidence now that we can show the kind of impact we're having. And it's been really useful in terms of kind of, I suppose, our wider policy work in terms of sort of trying to make the case for why access to sort of enrichment and sort of youth work and personal development opportunities is so important for young people.
Have you had any surprising discoveries in the data that you're now using? Part
of the 4 Wellbe measures, which are the sort of wellbeing measures, there's one on anxiety. And when we first looked at the data, I mean, this was a bit of a leap of faith for us, I guess, because we, thought we didn't actually know what we were going to find. And we found that although we were seeing statistically significant positive improvements in the other 3 measures, Anxiety, we weren't sort of, and we were thinking, wow, this is interesting. It's a very anxious time for young people. We know that we've seen, but I guess, to be honest, it was a bit disappointing in the sense if we looked at this and thought, we'd really hoped that we were having a more positive impact on this. But that was when the ability to compare it to the sort of national data sets came in really handy, because then when we looked at that and we compared it to sort of what young people were reporting generally, anxiety was still going up for DofE participants, but it wasn't going up as much as the sort of general population. And again, sort of we have some speculation in this as to kind of what's happening. But I think one of the things that was a really interesting, sort of thread for us to follow was sort of the idea that perhaps participation in DofE is acting as a bit of a protective factor for young people. It's not eliminating anxiety, and adolescence is a sort of classically quite anxious time anyway. But it allowed for a level of, I suppose, sort of interpretation and sort of stepping back and thinking, and particularly the ability to compare it to sort of the youth population as a whole has been really, really helpful.
And how about thinking about different ways that you deliver the programmes? Is there anything that you've discovered? I mean, obviously, DofE, given that I embarked on and failed to complete my goal, it was a couple of decades ago now. You've been going for a long time.
Yeah.
So you'd think that you'd sort of have a decent idea of the best way to be delivering the programs. But with this new data, with this access to new information, is there anything that you think, we might actually need to modify or adapt how we're doing things?
That I think as we start to be able to delve into this in a bit more detail, that's kind of definitely what we're hoping is going to emerge from this. So we were able in the last, when we did the sort of first impact report, to say that kind of we're seeing actually slightly sort of increased positive benefits for young women, for example. But we'd really love to sort of delve into that a bit more, and particularly thinking about how we link it back to the sort of quality work that we're doing. So we know that the relationship with the sort of adult leader is really important in terms of youth work and sort of personal development. So we're going to be able to sort of look at some of this data and think, well, actually, where are we having the biggest impacts, and kind of what's going on, and really delving into kind of what are we doing that we think is driving this. And likewise, for those where we're seeing a lower level of positive impact, it's going to allow us to sort of look at, are there ways in which we could deliver the programme differently? Are there areas of sort of best practice? I mean, it ultimately allows us to sort of drill down right to a level of a sort of individual school or youth group, for example. So we could, I think capacity is going to be our big challenge here, because we've probably got more data than we know what to do with, and we're collecting more all the time.
So we watch this space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's probably one of our challenges at the moment, is sort of working out where we want to focus next, because there's so many things that we could do. But yeah, certainly as a tool for sort of really understanding kind of where are we seeing best practice and how do we sort of share that? Where are we seeing particularly good practice in relation to working with particular demographics of young people and trying to share that across? We work with sort of nearly sort of 7,000 different organisations who deliver DofE programmes in all sorts of different sort of settings and contexts. So that ability to be able to sort of extract and to use it as a tool. One of the things that we hadn't expected with this is that we're using it as well as a bit of a sort of preemptive safeguarding tool. So because we're collecting data from young people on wellbeing, we have effectively a system that allows us to sort of monitor if young people are reporting very low levels of wellbeing. We have a sort of automated alert system, which then basically means we can alert the relevant organisation to sort of check in on that young person. So it's had some surprising, I think we weren't necessarily expecting that. And because a lot of impact data is anonymised, usually you can't use it for those purposes. That's been, I think, a really positive development.
And in terms of some of the challenges that you might be encountering, what do you do when maybe the data isn't showing you quite what you'd hoped? And how do you go about reporting that?
Well, I think we set out through this process to try and be really transparent about it. The whole point of doing a theory of change is that it's a theory. We are really trying to be quite sort of curious, I guess. As you said, Lucinda, we've been, it's our 70th birthday next year. So we've been doing this for a really long time. We'd always had a lot of sort of anecdotal, I suppose, people reporting the kinds of things that they'd experienced and kind of the benefits they'd got from it. So this ability to try and put some sort of empirical data underneath this has been a really important step forward for us. it also allows us to kind of, sort of critique ourselves. One of the areas that when we looked at the data is that we'd assumed we were going to have an impact on empathy and sort of levels of it. So that's a kind of important part of social and emotional development for young people. And the data came back and said, well, you're not really, which was interesting. But we've reported that, I think, and that's something that kind of, we saw that actually young people were starting with really high levels of empathy. So that was, it creates kind of useful data and questions for us to interrogate. Is there more that we can do in that space? Is it that actually we might ultimately update our theory of change to say perhaps we reduce kind of the assumption that we're having a big impact on this because the data isn't showing it. But it all provides useful tools for kind of self-reflection and curiosity. And that was sort of the purpose of this. We want to be able to provide young people with the best possible framework to help support their personal development. And that is the lives of young people are changing, really rapidly. Their experiences are changing. So kind of we need to make sure that this data helps us to kind of make sure that we are sort of staying relevant. We've seen huge concerns about rising rates of mental ill health amongst young people. So we're really curious about, well, what else could we do more? Are there other things where are we having an impact, and what else might we do? We've also done a lot with this data to sort of triangulate it as well with young people, and so sort of say, does this reflect, what you think you're experiencing? So we make sure we don't lose ourselves too much in sort of numbers and statistics, and kind of we continue to ensure and sort of test back that these sort of findings resonate with our participants.
It does sound like a huge amount of work, and you've already mentioned that you have external support whilst trying to develop your in-house capacity. Have you had to make a significant investment to implement this new framework and make sure that you are collecting and analysing these big amounts of data that you've decided to have?
One of the reasons that we really liked this approach where we used sort of open data was that we felt that it was a really cost-effective way of doing this. So partly you kind of could identify questions that had already been peer-reviewed and already had a big data set behind them. That was really helpful in terms of having a sort of comparison data set, but it also meant that all of that work to set up the questions and do good quality research was sort of, was there already. And we were, I guess, benefiting from, we are very fortunate in the UK to have an enormous range of really good public data. And so I'd say for sort of other charities thinking about this, it's really sensible to have a look at, in terms of the outcomes you're having kind of who's collecting data on some of these things already, and can you use that rather than sort of inventing your own. We were also fortunate in the sense that we have quite a well developed, I guess, data system, in that we have the ability to sort of track all of our participants and track progress through their program and kind of essentially attribute data to sort of individuals. So that really helped us. I think if we hadn't had that, this would have been a much taller order. But at the moment we have one full-time impact sort of officer role and one other person who's sort of part-time, and they essentially do all of their work with a bit of help from State of Life in terms of the analysis work. But as I said, some of that is like we're transferring a lot of that knowledge in-house. So in terms of the sort of ongoing cost, there was some cost associated with the sort of setup and making sure the questions were sort of embedded, but it wasn't particularly arduous because we had our system already up. And then we've had to invest a little bit in that kind of safeguarding alert process to make sure that we are, if we're getting data about that kind of alerts us to the fact that perhaps a young person struggling, that we have a sort of timely approach to be able to follow that up. But I think, probably for colleagues across the sector listening, kind of, it hasn't cost us as much as you might think from kind of, I suppose, perhaps what I've described. And that was something that was really attractive about this approach for us. And we've been working quite closely. We're a member of the Back Youth Alliance, which is a sort of coalition of the kind of sort of national youth sector organisations. And so we've been working with them to sort of share some of our experiences and working sort of collectively to think about whether we can create some sort of shared outcomes and sort of questions, that sort of research questions that we would use to mean that the sort of the youth sector more broadly can benefit from the work that we've all been doing on impact measurement, and try to get to the point where actually there's a sort of simple framework that the organisations can pick up and sort of tailor to their own needs, but that, you don't have to invent everything yourself. And the advantage, obviously, of having the national data sets is that the comparison data is constantly regenerated. And so, you can really benefit from the fact that, there'll be new sort of tranches of data released periodically, and you can think about, well, how do you time the work that you're doing to be able to match that, so you can really compare what your findings with the sort of the national population in quite a timely fashion.
And that impact officer role that you mentioned, was that newly created, or has that always been there?
No, that was newly created. So that was sort of in order to basically sort of manage both the sort of development of the framework, and then obviously there's quite a lot of work, and there could be significantly more people involved in doing this. Obviously we have a lot of data. As all organisations, you have to sort of pace yourself. We have to make choices as to kind of what's most important to us. I think, we could probably find lots of work for lots more people in this space, but I think for colleagues listening, it doesn't have to be a huge undertaking, and you don't have to set up an entire department for this. And that was a sort of important principle for us. We wanted this to be something that we could sustain, essentially, and that kind of this wasn't just going to be something that you could do now but then not be able to sort of sustain over time.
And for any colleagues in the sector who are perhaps at the earlier stages of a similar change, introduction of a new way of measuring their impact, would you have any sort of parting words of wisdom for them?
I'd say probably that what we found, that theory of change piece of work, really important. So you need to know what impact you're trying to have.
Yeah.
And I think that sounds obvious, but sometimes it's quite easy to get, you're sort of going, you're sort of in the day-to-day of things, and you're just doing what you always do. So taking a bit of time to sort of step back, talk to your sort of beneficiaries and all the people who are involved in delivering what you do, and really sort of interrogate it. It can feel a bit scary, but actually it's really important to refresh that sort of periodically. The world changes quite a lot, and the way that you do things therefore needs to sort of evolve and update. But it's a really fantastic conversation to have, and once you've sort of bottomed it out and you've got a clear sense of what it is you're trying, then you can go and have a look at, well, what else is out there at the moment, and kind of what data do we collect on this already. Because as I said, there's a huge amount of really good quality data in the UK, so we don't need to reinvent the wheel in the sector. And I think I'd really advocate the approach that we've taken as something that is both quite simple, but is allowing us, I think, to get some really good quality data and to refresh that sort of regularly, without having to invest, a huge amount in a kind of, dedicated team that sort of, and lots of sort of internal research and sort of expertise. And, if anybody's interested and wants to know more, I'm sort of, myself and the team are very happy to sort of share our experiences, because I think, it's really been a really positive experience for us. And I think we're in a much stronger position as a charity in terms of being able to both to evidence our impact, but to sort of support young people to understand kind of what's happening for them, which was sort of the ultimate aim of this sort of right from the outset. And so very happy to sort of share this, and we're doing a lot of work with the youth sector, as I said, to try and sort of help both big national charities, but also sort of much smaller grassroots organisations think about how they can use this kind of approach to be able to gather really, really good, robust data without necessarily a huge amount of sort of cost and infrastructure.
That's great to know, and thank you very much for sharing all of these insights with us today. It sounds like very exciting times ahead, and we look forward to seeing what comes out at
Thanks
DofE.
very much.
Thank you. We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Ruth, and that's it for this episode. From all of us at Third Sector, thank you so much for listening. Our producer is Nav Pal.